What if the angels assigned to protect humanity were the very ones who destroyed it? Not a medieval invention, not a conspiracy theory, a story found in texts over 2,000 years old, with named angels, specific crimes, and punishments so detailed they read like a divine criminal indictment. You have probably read Genesis 6:4. The sons of God came in to the daughters of humans, and they bore children to them. 2 sentences. Then the flood. Most readers hit that verse, pause for a second, and move on, because nobody ever explains it. The Book of Enoch does. It is a Jewish text written roughly between the 3rd and 2nd century BCE, part of what scholars call the pseudepigrapha, meaning writings attributed to a famous ancient figure but composed later. It fills in what Genesis left blank, and what it describes is genuinely unsettling. The Watchers were not generic angels. They were a specific class, described in the Book of Enoch as beings whose entire purpose was to observe and guard humanity from a distance without ever crossing into personal contact. Think of them less as guardians and more as sentinels posted at a perimeter. Their assignment was to watch. That was the job. And for a long time they did it. But the Book of Enoch names their leader as Semyaza, and then lists 19 other named captains, including Azazel, Armaros, and Barakel. That level of detail gives this group a military-style hierarchy that makes them feel less like divine servants and more like a structured rebel faction with ranks, responsibilities, and a chain of command. What gets me about this is the specificity. Ancient texts do not usually name 20 leaders of anything unless those names carried weight in the tradition that preserved them. The text then tells us that 200 of these watchers descended onto Mount Hermon, a real mountain sitting on the border of modern-day Lebanon and Syria. And the name Hermon itself is linked etymologically to the Hebrew word for forbidden or curse. You will not find that detail on a Sunday school poster. The mountain where angels broke their vows was literally named for the act of breaking them. The crime the Watchers committed was actually 2 crimes, and the ancient text treats them as equally serious. The first was taking human women as wives. This was not framed as romantic. It was framed as a violation of the boundary between the heavenly and earthly realms, a line that was apparently absolute. The second crime was arguably worse. They shared forbidden divine knowledge with humanity. And the Book of Enoch is remarkably specific about who taught what. Azazel is singled out as the one who taught men how to make swords, knives, shields, and body armor. He also taught women cosmetic arts, including how to use antimony, eyeshadow, and precious stones. So in one figure, you have the acceleration of both warfare and vanity simultaneously. That pairing is not accidental. The text frames both as corruptions of the natural order, tools for violence, and tools for deception handed down together. Other Watchers taught astrology, the cutting of roots for potions, enchantments, and the reading of omens. The text does not frame any of this as a gift. Every piece of knowledge the Watchers passed down is described as something that caused moral collapse across the ancient world. The implication is clear. Some knowledge was never meant for human hands. The offspring of the Watchers and human women were the Nephilim. And you have probably seen that word in Genesis 6:4, without a clear explanation of what it means. The Book of Enoch fills that gap in ways that are hard to forget. Some manuscript traditions give the Nephilim a height of 3,000 cubits, which works out to roughly 4,500 feet. That number is clearly symbolic, not literal. It is a way of communicating magnitude, not a measurement. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments found at Qumran in 1947, offer a more grounded and honestly more disturbing picture. Those texts describe the Nephilim consuming all available human food supplies first. Then, when the food ran out, turning to eating humans. And finally, when humans were gone, devouring each other. It reads like a cascading ecological and social collapse, each stage worse than the last. I spent a fair amount of time going through the Qumran material on this, and what struck me was how methodically it was described. This was not chaos. It was sequence. Scholar Dr. George Nicholsberg one of the leading voices in Second Temple Jewish literature. That is the period of Jewish history, roughly between the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and its destruction in 70 CE, argues that the Nephilim narrative functions as a theological explanation for why the world became so violent and corrupt that the flood became necessary. The Watchers did not just break a rule, they set in motion everything that followed. Here is where the story takes a turn that I think most people are completely unprepared for. The punishment God hands down to the Watchers is not vague. It is not they were cast out or they were judged. It reads like a legal sentence with named executioners and specific methods. The Archangel Raphael is commanded to bind Azazel hand and foot, throw him into a pit of sharp and jagged rocks in the desert of Dudael, cover him with darkness, and keep him there until the day of judgment. That is a passage you can sit with for a while. The specificity of it, the sharp rocks, the named desert, the binding, it does not read like mythology. It reads like a verdict, and many scholars draw a direct line between this passage and the Levitical scapegoat ritual described in Leviticus 16, where a goat is sent into the wilderness, bearing the sins of the people. The Hebrew name used in Leviticus for that ritual destination is Azazel, one verse, one name, so much to unpack. 2. Semyaza and the other 199 watchers receive a different sentence. They are bound beneath the hills of the earth for 70 generations before their final judgment, and the Archangel Michael is tasked with carrying out that sentence. What you end up with is a divine courtroom proceeding, complete with charges named defendants, assigned executioners, and scheduled sentencing. The text treats this with complete institutional seriousness. The Book of Enoch was excluded from most official biblical canons around the 4th century CE. That is the collection of texts the Church formally recognized as authoritative scripture. But here is what makes the exclusion complicated. The New Testament letter of Jude, verses 14 and 15, quotes the Book of Enoch directly by name, not paraphrases it, quotes it. That makes the Book of Enoch one of the only non-canonical texts to be explicitly cited in the Christian Bible. You have a book that was voted out of the canon, but whose words were considered authoritative enough to appear inside the canon. That tension is real, and it is worth sitting with. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never accepted that exclusion. They still include the Book of Enoch as fully canonical scripture to this day, treating it with the same weight as Genesis or Isaiah. The book was also widely read during the Second Temple period, meaning the era of Judaism between roughly 516 BCE and 70 CE, when many of the New Testament writers were formed. The Watchers were not a fringe idea. They were part of the theological air that early Christianity breathed. Honestly, this is what gets me about the way this story is usually presented. It is treated as a curiosity, a footnote, but the writers of the New Testament knew this material. They cited it. The question of why it was eventually sidelined is a whole conversation on its own. The story of the Watchers did not stop influencing people when the canon closed. C.S. Lewis drew on Watcher mythology for the Eldils in his space trilogy. Those ambiguous celestial beings who exist just outside human perception and whose loyalties are not always clear. The parallel is not accidental. Lewis knew his patristic literature, meaning the writings of the early church fathers, and the Watcher tradition runs through that material. Then, in 2014, director Darren Aronofsky released his film, Noah, and he depicted the Watchers as stone-covered giants, fallen beings who had become literally encrusted with the earth they had descended into. It is a striking visual interpretation, and it divided audiences sharply. Some found it too strange. But if you have read the Book of Enoch, Aronofsky's choice makes a kind of theological sense. These are beings who crossed from one realm into another and were transformed by the crossing. The image of stone-covered angels is not random. It is a visual argument about what happens when heavenly beings try to become earthly ones. What I find worth noting, without using that phrase as a filler, is that this 2,000-year-old story keeps finding new forms because the question at its center never gets old. Where is the line between the divine and the human? What happens when that line is crossed? The Watchers are one ancient culture's answer, and it is a remarkably serious one. Genesis 6:4. 2 sentences. You have probably read it a dozen times. Now you know what was behind it. The Watchers are not a mystery invented to sell books or fill a documentary runtime. They are a serious theological tradition that shaped how ancient Jewish and early Christian writers understood corruption, divine judgment, and the catastrophic cost of crossing boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. The Bible remembered them. History forgot. Now you have not. If this opens something up for you, the video on the Nephilim in the Dead Sea Scrolls goes even deeper. It is linked right here. Subscribe if you want more of this. There is a lot left to unpack.